welcome to Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm Patrick Bratton, filling in for Carlos Juarez. We're joined today by a very special guest, a good friend of mine and colleague, Dr. Russell Hart, Professor of History at Hawaii Pacific University. Good to have you here today, Russell.
It's great to be here, Patrick. Thank you very much for having me.
This is not the first time you've been on ThinkTech, right?
No, I'm a think tank veteran. This has been my second time on Think Tank, so I'm very pleased to be invited back.
Excellent, excellent. So today what I thought we would do is have you kind of introduce yourself and talk more about yourself and your background, and particularly focusing this episode upon sort of myths of World War II, mostly focusing upon the European theater of World War II, which is one of your primary research interests. So as I'm sure you get this a lot, from your accent, you're not from around here. So what brought you to Hawaii? Where are you from originally?
Yeah, well, I'm a Londoner by upbringing, and I came to the States as an international exchange student some time ago, a few years ago, and studied military history at Ohio State University and got my master's and PhD there, and been teaching here at Hawaii Pacific University for over 15 years now.
Okay, so you're a Buckeye then?
I'm a Buckeye. I'm a Buckeye, yes.
Well, in addition to having a big football team and other things, I mean, Ohio State is known for having a very prestigious military history program.
Yes, it does. That was the primary reason why I decided to go to Ohio State and study. So some very premier military historians and a very large pool of talented graduate students who I studied with and learned from.
Who was there that you worked with, that you took classes with at that time?
Well, my advisors were Williamson Murray, who's a World War II military and diplomatic historian, and also Alan R. Millett, also a World War II American military historian, Korean War specialist. Jeffrey Parker, a very famous early modernist, and Joe Gilmartin, Vietnam War vet and early modern specialist as well. So,
Mr. War Galley.
Mr. War Galleys, yes, Gunpowders and Galleys, one of his more famous works. So, yes, I was very lucky to be mentored by some of the premier military historians in the United States.
And so, what was your work on that you started during your PhD?
Yes, so Ohio State, I started on research on the 1944 Normandy campaign, and my interest in that period of military history stems from family experiences. I had a great uncle who was a paratrooper in the Second World War who dropped at Arnhem in September 1944 and was captured by the SS and unfortunately contracted tuberculosis in a German field hospital, and was permanently disabled for the rest of his life. And as a youngster, we'd visit him and ask him what had happened to him, and he made the fatal mistake of never telling me what had happened to him to the war, so I had to go up to the library and check out every book on the Second World War to try and find out the answer. And that's really where my interest in the Second World War and National Socialism, Nazi ideology and its connections to violence and militarism really stemmed from. And so I did my research for my doctoral dissertation at Ohio State and published that in 2001, Clash of Arms, How the Allies Won in Normandy, which was a not too bad book. It was a quite good book. So.
Which a book we'll come back to in greater depth later on in our show. I was just I have to ask the obligatory question. Did you ask him whether or not it was like the movie Bridge Too Far, or?
He said he really did not want to talk about his wartime experiences, period. So getting him to say more than one syllable of no was very difficult. So I'm sure that he found some elements of the movie reminiscent and others completely preposterous. So.
As is often the case.
As is often the case with
yes. War movies, yes.
Yes.
And so you've come here, you've been at HBU for about 13, 15 years?
15 years, yes. Doesn't time fly when you're having fun?
Yes. And so what brought you to Hawaii and HBU? I mean, going from, the UK to Ohio to Hawaii is not necessarily a
Not-
very
not-
common.
Not a common beaten path, no. I don't tend to follow the common beaten path. I came to Hawaii State to Hawaii Pacific University to help teach in our Diplomacy and Military Studies program. It's a very interesting program. I'm now the director of the Diplomacy.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. But I was attracted to coming to Hawaii to participate in that program. It's an interdisciplinary program. We study the intersections between force and statecraft, and we do that from multiple disciplinary perspectives: history, political science, international studies, international relations, and other supporting cognate disciplines. And there's relatively few programs in the country where you can really look at the complex intersections between force and statecraft from multiple disciplinary perspectives. So I was attracted to that, the interdisciplinarity of the program, and that was a primary reason why I came to Hawaii Pacific University, and I have stayed, and I'm now directing the program. So. And it's a wonderful experience. I have some wonderful colleagues, including yourself, and most importantly is our students. We have some really outstanding master's students in our graduate program. The MADMS degree is one of the flagship programs at Hawaii Pacific University. It's the second largest graduate program, and we really have a very diverse mix of students, traditional students straight out of undergraduate, lots of practicing professionals, from the Department of Defense or civilian contractors. And so we have a really, really diverse student body, lots of international students from Europe and Asia Pacific. So we really have a really wonderful mix in the classroom. And that's why teaching in the program is exciting, because whenever you go to class, you just never know what's going to come up in classroom discussion. So it's always remains exciting and keeps you on your toes. So, yeah.
One thing that's, sometimes people call it a cliche, but I believe it's quite true, is that you learn a lot through teaching. And I wonder if you could maybe share two experiences, one in which you really felt that you learned material by having to teach it, and another one where you sort of more directly learned from your students, two things that really have sort of maybe stayed with you over the years.
Well, I think one of the most memorable moments was a few years ago when the international debate was going on about the Danish newspaper cartoons that had caricatured the Prophet Muhammad and the backlash that had caused in certain Muslim countries. And we had a seminar one night, and this was not the subject of discussion for that night, but somehow the discussion got round to that issue. I had two students in the class. I had a Danish student, and I had an Egyptian student. And the two of them started having a conversation about this issue, and we just abandoned the topic for the night because this was the most sophisticated and meaningful, sustained intellectual discussion that I had heard on the issue. So the whole class just sat there and listened and joined in, and we just we talked about the topic, and that really was the microcosm of what the program is all about: bringing people from different perspectives and exposing them to different perspectives. You look at contemporary international relations, one of the major problems navigating international relations, of course, is understanding where potential allies and prospective enemies are coming from. So really having that dialogue is very important. And here in the classroom, a microcosm of the globe, we had people having a meaningful intellectual discussions about significant contemporary issues that divided cultures and nations. And so that's really what we try to focus on in the program, and particularly in our graduate seminars, which are very much focused on discussion. They're not lectures, they're discussions. They're small class size. Many classes are 12 to 14, 16 students. So you really can get a lot of one-on-one interaction and lots of discussion. So that's a really meaningful. That was a really meaningful, memorable experience. Can I think of another one off the top of my head? Well, I think not something I learned so much, one of my students learned. So I just comes to mind. I had a email from a student who graduated over a decade ago, and they just wrote me and saying that they had gone on and that they had done a master's degree and a PhD and were now teaching at a PME service academy. And they wrote to thank me because they said it was something I had said in seminar over a decade ago had triggered an intellectual interest. And having got their master's degree here, they had gone on. And unknown to me, I had no idea they'd done this, but that had stuck with them, and that became a central focus for their research. And they're now teaching military history to US service personnel. So, you know, those are the kinds of long-term benefits of learning. And yeah, I mean, the classroom is the best place to learn. I love teaching because every semester, every seminar, you gain some new insight that you've never seen before. And it's, you know, it's always amazing how, you know, someone can say something even on your research specialty that you've never ever thought about in your entire career, and you know, bring new illumination to your intellectual interests. That's very special, and that's not easy to find. So I really do enjoy teaching.
And one other thing that stands out for me is that you've been very pioneering in a sense of utilizing and taking advantage of sort of the location and the history that we have here in Hawaii. Because on the one hand, I mean, there's a very sort of rich history that Hawaii has, and then also a sort of rich but often overlooked sort of military history. And you've been quite pioneering and sort of teaching courses and organizing seminars about this, correct?
Yes, yes, I have. I mean, you know, obviously Hawaii has a very rich military history, but unfortunately, it's a rather well-hidden history. It's there before a couple of years ago, there wasn't a college course on the military history of Hawaii taught anywhere in the world, and so a couple of years ago, I thought that was unfortunate that students studying in Hawaii couldn't immerse themselves in the very rich and very significant military history of Hawaii. It's obviously profoundly shaped the Hawaiian Islands, it profoundly shaped the United States and its history. So I thought, well, there needed to be a college course on the military history of Hawaii. So because there's no programs in the world that teach the military history of Hawaii, organizing that was challenging, but I actually managed to assemble 14 faculty, all of whom had some area of expertise that touched upon the military history of Hawaii. And together, we built and team taught a military history of Hawaii course, and it's a field-based experiential learning seminar. So we go out in the field and we visit, you know, Oahu's most famous battlefield sites. Obviously, the Battle of Nuuanu, Pearl Harbor, Ford Island, U.S. Arizona, of course, the USS Missouri, and we like to have a sleepover on the battleship, the USS Missouri, which is something that very few people have an opportunity to do. And the U.S. Missouri Memorial Museum, we have a good partnership with them and go regularly. We just went for Veterans Day. We take a student group biannually now, and we sleep over on the battleship Missouri, which really, you know, is a microcosm of American military history. So we now offer that course quite regularly, and it's the only course of its kind in the world. And I just recall the first time we taught it, we did a summer program, I just recall one comment from a student who said, you know, I've lived in Hawaii for the best part of a decade, and I learned more about the place where I lived in this 3-week seminar than I had in the previous 10 years. And that really, you know, that really encompasses what the purpose of higher education is all about. So it's obviously very satisfying when you get those kind of rave reviews from students who are, you know, a tough audience to please, you know.
Yes,
young students today, tough audience.
Yes, they can be. Well, with that in mind, we're going to take a short commercial break now, and we'll come back with Dr. Russell Hart and talk about some of his research.
Aloha, this is Alice V. Hagan from ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My show is a bi-weekly show on Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m. We invite interesting people, entrepreneurs, fascinating leaders who contribute to the social economic well-being of our state. Please tune in to my show, Business Education Spotlight, ThinkTech Hawaii, bi-weekly, Thursday, 3 to 4 p.m. Aloha.
Aloha. Welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii. My name is Josh Green. I'm a senator from the Big Island and a physician. I host a show weekly called Healthcare in Hawaii, where we talk about the most important issues in healthcare for our state, whether it's the dengue fever outbreak, the state of our public hospitals, how to find physicians and nurses for our patients, or really just the best things to do for our family's health. That's what you'll find on this show. I'll bring experts to your attention, and we'll have a free-flowing dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Aloha! How you doing? It's me, Angus McTech, wishing you to welcome and join us to see us on Hibachi Talk on ThinkTech Hawaii. Join my co-hosts, Gordo the Tech Czar and Andrew the Security Guy, every Friday from 1300 to 1345. We look forward to seeing you. We'll talk tech and we'll have some wee bit of fun. And remember, let your wing gang free wherever you be. Aloha!
Hello.
Hi,
I'm Patrick Bratton on ThinkTech Hawaii, and with me is Dr. Russell Hart, a specialist in military history, particularly World War II. But before the break, we were talking with Russell about some of his background, some of his teaching. What I'd like to do right now is sort of get into sort of the research that he's been doing, because he's quite a well-known historian, and particularly given the, how should we say, the history, if you will, of World War II in Hawaii, something interesting to engage with. So you had mentioned before the break that your first book that came out of your doctoral dissertation was Clash of Arms, which is about the Normandy campaign, right?
Yes, yes it was. Yes, so one of my areas of interest is combat effectiveness. I'm very interested in examining and understanding how militaries perform during combat. And so what I wanted to do was to understand the outcome of the Normandy campaign. How was it that the campaign evolved the way that it did? How narrow was the Allied victory? In retrospect, we look back and it has a element of certainty to it, but certainly that wasn't the perception at the time. General Eisenhower, of course, had that famous note in his pocket, his concession speech, where he was prepared on the 6th of June to stand up and publicly announce that he had launched the invasion, and the invasion had failed. And he actually kept that piece of paper in his pocket for at least 5 days after the Allies landed on D-Day on the 6th of June, 1944. So it shows you that there's never certainty to military victory. So that was really one of the intellectual interests that I have, is understanding the outcome of combat. And so I did a comparative analysis examining Allied and Axis combat effectiveness in the Normandy campaign, comparing British, American, Canadian, and German military performance in the campaign. And it's very interesting. It examined and challenged a number of myths and stereotypes that we have about the performance of the Allies in the Second World War. Probably one of those interesting findings I came up with was essentially to argue that the American Army, the U.S. Army, performed the most effectively amongst the major Allied combatants, and also against common stereotype. In fact, the German army proved to be pretty adaptable during the course of the campaign, at least at the tactical and up to the operational level. German military's failures always, of course, are at the operational and strategic and grand strategic levels, where their performance historically has always been rather weak. So that was, those were the major conclusions that I found in the work. That upset a few people. I'm quite good at upsetting quite a few people, so I was equal opportunity offender. So but it contributed to ongoing debate about combat effectiveness that has dominated the historiography for the last couple of decades. And has helped, I would like to think, has helped shape the continuation of that debate with new questions and new research, some of which have upheld my conclusions and in some cases challenged them. And looking back at some of that new scholarship, there's some parts of it I would probably revise, but I think the majority of the conclusions are still hold water a decade after it was first published. So.
One of the things interesting, kind of why I wanted to title this program sort of Myths of World War II, and you mentioned upsetting people. Because on many sides, World War II is such a huge and important event, and in many ways a terrible event, but in many ways sort of, for some countries, particularly the US, the UK, Soviet Union, sort of the last good war, in a sense. So people have very strong myths that they build up, sort of historical narratives about how their country performed in the war, how various countries performed. And so maybe if you wanted to maybe pick at a few of these myths and maybe see if you can reach out to some of your other audience you haven't offended, no, just kidding, that are watching. So for example, I mean, one group that always is somewhat controversial is the Canadian military, right? Canada, which has traditionally not been a sort of a martial nation, you know, what are some of the myths that came out of the World War II for the Canadians that then you addressed in your book?
Yeah, so I think, you know, the Canadians are very interesting. I mean, the reality was, you know, that in the interwar period, there were no significant threats to Canada's national security, and therefore Canada neglected its military during the Great Depression. Obviously, very severe funding cutbacks. So Canada went to war in September 1939, utterly unprepared for what was going to be the largest global conflict in human history. So not surprisingly, that was a very steep curve for the Canadian military to climb. And you know, the performance of Canadian military during the war has often been a controversial subject. Essentially two schools of thought. There's the nationalist school, which has endeavored to defend the Canadian military's performance, and then the other school, which essentially emphasized the Canadian military deficiencies. So in my comparative study, I mean, what I did was to compare Canadian performance against British and the American performance, and try to rank their relative combat effectiveness. And I would say I rank the Canadians in the Normandy campaign as last behind the British and the US. Again, given that martial history, given the very limited resources that the Canadians had, their very limited military experience, none of that is at all surprising. What I did note, however, was that the Canadians, once the Canadians had got into significant combat in Normandy, that they actually proved better at learning from that experience than perhaps the British Army that had trained them, and there was their model of war fighting was built upon, obviously, on the British imperial model. And what we're going to see, particularly during 1944 and into 1945, is a gradual breaking away from that British tradition and a movement, a migration towards adopting a more American approach that better fit the realities of Canadian combat. So certainly in 44-45, the Canadian Army learned quite rapidly from its combat experience, and therefore this meant that in the latter months of the Second World War, in the spring of 1945, the Canadian military performance was certainly superior to when they had first landed in Normandy. So that's very interesting. And, you know, really, when you look at ground combat forces, I mean, the vital thing is the extent to which militaries can adapt to combat, because however hard a military profession trains for conflict, it never ever adheres to the preconceptions of future conflict. So really victory has a lot to do with the ability of militaries to adapt to ongoing and changing combat conditions. You know, and that's, you know, the reality of all combat, is that combat is always dynamic. Its basic features continually evolve and change over time. The militaries that can adapt the most rapidly are those more likely to be victorious. But of course, tactical and operational adaptation can never guarantee victory. Strategic errors can be irreversible. So.
One thing that you mentioned in passing I would like to pick up on is you talked about how the Canadians, while they maybe started off having a rough time, sort of broke away from a British model, moving to a more sort of American model. Again, one of the images that we have, right, is sort of the combat efficiency, say, of the British Army, you know, the regimental spirit and all of these sorts of things, and how particularly, you know, the image is often given of the Americans learning from the British, particularly in terms of intelligence and other things throughout the war. But one of the findings that you found in your book is that, you know, this British Army, even under the capable leadership of Field Marshal Montgomery, had a lot of difficulty adapting to the Normandy campaign. I mean, what's the story? Because that seems counterintuitive, right?
Well, of course, the British military entered the Second World War with some very significant obstacles that they had overcome. I mean, essentially, this was a military designed for imperial policing an empire that stretched around the world. It wasn't designed for continental commitment. Remember, in the interwar period, the pervasive view amongst Britons, both the leadership and civilian population, was that the Great War was a catastrophe. It should never have happened, and it could never be allowed to happen again. So in the interwar period, certainly very, very few leaders in Great Britain were contemplating, planning, preparing for sending a substantial expeditionary force to fight on the continent of Europe again. And not surprisingly, the British, given the psychological trauma of the Great War, the catastrophic loss of life, the decimation of a generation of leaders, that in the interwar period, unfortunately, the British military often tried hard to forget about the Great War because it was an anomaly that could never be allowed to happen again. So what was the point of studying and learning and inculcating its lessons when the correct strategy for the future was to, through diplomacy and international relations, to prevent such a catastrophe ever happening again? So obviously in September 1939, once again, the British, as the Canadians, had a very steep learning curve to try and ramp up for continental engagement against the best military of the world of its time, the German military. And so I think that explains a lot of the surprising things. So, for example, there's on the morning of D-Day when the British invading divisions, advanced battalion advances and captures a high ground, and when they go over the top of that hill, they're surprised by finding that the Germans are dug in on the rearward slope, and unfortunately the attack is decimated and driven back. In the after-action report, describes the surprise that the British soldiers encountered at finding Germans dug in on the rear slope. Unfortunately, that had been standard German defensive doctrine since 1916, and it's something that the British Army had learned at great cost very well in the Great War. But again, in the intervening interwar period, that institutional knowledge had hemorrhaged with the turnover of personnel and the unwillingness to contemplate having to fight that kind of catastrophic conflict again in the future. So the regimental system was also a system that had great benefits and also some drawbacks. When you have an imperial military that's garrisoning around the world, a regimental system is very useful for maintaining cohesion and identity. But one of the drawbacks of a regimental system was that it tended to compartmentalize learning in the British military. So individual regiments would pursue their own retraining and training programs. And so that made it difficult to have a kind of universal doctrine and universal training. There'd be a lot of individual divergence from official doctrine based upon the institutional memory of individual regiments. So that made learning more challenging. It also made cooperation and coordination more difficult. When you have a very deeply ingrained regimental system, obviously the Second World War required different arms of service to combine together and coordinate together in a way that had never been required before in the history of warfare. So all of the protagonists struggled to combine different combat arms together. And those that did the best job, Germans, the Soviets, and the United States, learnt that the hard way through brutal trial and error on the battlefields of the Second World War.
Okay, we'll take another commercial break, and we'll come back and talk more about Russell Hart's research.
To Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy on Wednesday, and we have Sharon Moriwaki, my co-host and co-chair of the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum, and we have Warren Bohlmeyer today, a special guest with the Hawaii Renewable Energy Alliance, and also a member of the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum.
In fact, he's our Renewable Energy Working Group Chair. So he takes care of all of our...
You ought to see him in song and dance, too. He does the musical part of the show. Sharon is more serious than that, but not much more serious. So anyway, what do you think of this show? I mean, is this good?
I think this is good. We hope it's good. We hope it attracts a lot more people than our forum, so that people can see what's going on in energy and clean energy, and call in write in, tweet
Yeah,
or
we want
Twitter.
that.
or
We want public engagement, civic engagement from everybody, because that's the only way we're going to get down the road on this, right, Warren?
Yeah, I think so, and it's an opportunity for guys like me to share a little bit of their mana'o and sometimes get the facts right. Who was that guy that said, just give me the facts, you know, start with the facts and then work from there? Oh, it was Dragnet guy, right?
Yeah, right.
Oh, yeah.
Jack
That was what, I was
Jack
just,
Ram.
I was just
I
in
would
grade
all
school then, I
remember that.
barely
I was
remember
like,
that.
yeah.
Just the facts,
Just the
man.
man.
Here on Hawaii, the state of clean energy, every Wednesday from 4 to 5. You'll see. Come back soon. Right, Sharon?
Great.
Right, Warren?
Yes.
Hello, and we're back with Global Connections. I'm Patrick Bratton talking with Russell Hart about World War II. We've just got done sort of Spock talking about his work in Clash of Arms, looking at the various combat effectiveness of the different armies that took place in the Normandy campaign. And we've talked about the Canadians, the British, and the Americans. And I wanted to sort of move on to really sort of one of Russell's sort of niche areas that he specialized in, which is sort of the German army. And particularly going along with our myths theme that we have for today, I mean, there's a lot of myths, or one could say stereotypes about the German army. And a lot of this, I think, I kind of blame both, as you will probably talk about, memoirs in the 1950s, but also all those movies from the 50s, 60s, and 70s that I watched with my mother, normally starring Telly Savalas and Maximilian Schell, perhaps, about, you know, Battle of the Bulge and Bridge Too Far and things. But I mean, some of the myths that often come across for sort of World War II history buffs is obviously, you know, the German army was the most effective, and the legacy of sort of Prussian efficiency and on the battlefield and things like that. But then also there's the ideological dimension, the complicated relationship that the German army, the regular army, had with the Nazis and the SS. What would you say would be some of the myths that you've been sort of working or struggling against in sort of your revisionist history?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the historiography of the Second World War, the Cold War is really the decisive period in shaping post-war perspectives on the Second World War. You know, a lot of things were going on during the Cold War, particularly the Western world was confronting communism, the Iron Curtain had descended on continental Europe, and there was a very significant need to rehabilitate the discredited German military and create a new Bundeswehr and a new West German Republic as a bulwark, as a front bastion against the spread of communism into Europe. And this created some very kind of perplexing paradoxes in trying to remember the German military of the Second World War. And you look at those, look at the Cold War movies and war memoirs and books that were published. One of the major things that you didn't see was the emphasis on the role of ideology. Ideology was completely de-emphasized as a new democratic West German state and a West German democratic military. The Bundeswehr was recreated in the 1950s, and so there was, you know, kind of conspiracy, an international conspiracy to forget the ideological dimensions of the Second World War. And this is one of my major research areas, is the intersections between ideology and militarism and violence. And, you know, the reality was that the German military of the Second World War was an ideological military. It's an ideologically motivated military. National Socialism made significant inroads into the officer corps and NCO corps, in particular, of the German army prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. And during the course of the war, that process was completed, so that by the end of the war, you know, the German military was to a very significant degree a National Socialist military. So the racist, violent, aggressive ideology of National Socialism became infused in the German military, and this helps to explain some of the behaviors of the German military that we see in the war that in previous decades seemed perplexing, particularly the atrocities on the Eastern Front. You know, where the motif of the Cold War presented by German generals who had survived in their memoirs was that, you know, atrocities were committed by a minority of regime fanatics, the Nazi Party, the Gestapo, the SS, but the German army was clean, wasn't involved. They had been fighting at the front, and they didn't know what was going on in the rear areas, and they were ignorant of what was taking place. Of course, we know that today. We know that's just a flight of fantasy. We know the German army was well aware of, its leadership was complicit in and participated extensively in the Sonderbehandlung, the special handling operations, a euphemism for mass murder that took place in the rear areas of the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1942. And in fact, ironically, it was the failure of mass murder of racial undesirables, of Jews and Bolsheviks and other racial undesirables on the Eastern Front during 1941 and 1942 that played a major role in the emergence of, quote unquote, the final solution to the Jewish problem, the creation of extermination camps in an attempt to exterminate the Jewish population of Europe, which by 1945 had brought about the death of at least 7 million Europeans. That was in part a product of the failure of mass murder operations on the Eastern Front in 41-42. Because what happens when you take disciplined combat units and you employ them to murder innocent unarmed civilians is that has a significantly degrading effect on those combat units. Those units actually essentially fell apart. Their discipline and morale collapsed, which tells us something about that those participating knew what they were doing was illegal under German military law, and that they had profound negative psychological consequences for those who participated in mass murder. So the industrial mass execution, mass murder of enemies of the state through gassing, through Zyklon B, in extermination camps was a dehumanized industrial solution to a military and strategic problem. So this was an ideological regime. I mean, just to give one example from my current research, I'm looking at the last months of the war, writing a book on German efforts to rescue Hitler in Berlin in the last weeks of the war. And one of the things that, one of the common motifs that sustained the German fanaticism literally to the dying days of the war was the belief that that National Socialism and the Western Allies had a common enemy in Bolshevism, the Jewish Bolshevik threat, and that it was just only a matter of time before the Western Allies would wake up to the communist threat, as they would do in the Cold War, but too late for National Socialist Germany. So one of those SS generals, Felix Steiner, who's leading the counterattack on Berlin from the north, in late April 1944-5, he sent his Feldgendarmerie, his military police, over to the Elbe River, and they're posting signs in English giving directions in the distance to Berlin so that the British and American troops can come and join the German military to defeat the communist threat at the gates of Berlin, and then drive all the way back to Moscow again and defeat communism and destroy the Jewish Bolshevik threat. So, ideology is what held together the German military to a significant degree, and certainly in terms of the punishment it sustained in the latter years of the war was certainly in excess of the punishment that most militaries in human history have been able to endure. And ideology was an important ingredient of that cohesion and fanaticism that led Germans to fight on well beyond any meaningful strategic or operational objective.
One thing I found interesting about your work is because your work, when I was reading and engaging, challenged a lot of pre-existing ideas that I had, which I always tell my students is that's when you know something is valuable. You don't want just confirmation, you want something that challenges what you think. And so growing up, being a military history buff, growing up in high school and college, I read most of these memoirs of all these people like Mellenthin and Manstein and your favorite Heinz Guderian, and I was very much shaped by what they had written in the late 40s and into the 50s. And so you, a couple of years ago, kind of took aim at how this historiography of German generals and field marshals writing rather self-serving memoirs shaped our understanding of World War II. And you took aim, I would say, at perhaps the patron saint, if you will, of this group, which is General Heinz Guderian, right? And so you wrote a book, Heinz Guderian, Panzer Pioneer, Mythmaker, correct, right?
Yeah.
And so Hurrying Heinz, right, as I learned in my Time Life World War II history book that I read as a child, pioneer of the Blitzkrieg, and anything that the Germans did right in 1940 has its origins in Heinz Guderian, and so on and so forth. That's sort of the myth that we have. I mean, but you say that this is a myth. It's not actually true.
Yes, so I mean, Heinz Guderian's memoirs, Panzer Leaders, amongst the most widely read memoir of the Second World War. It's helped to shape multiple generations' perspective on the Second World War. Unfortunately, it would honestly be better classified as a work of fiction. It is very substantially distorts reality, and so over years of research, I would come across the evidence that that emphasized the extent of the distortions and the misrepresentations that were common in Guderian's memoirs, and I finally decided that there needed to be a corrective written, and so I wrote a short biography that really took to task Guderian's self-serving and distorted memoirs and attempted to place his military career into better context. And Guderian was a survivor, and he was an incredibly ambitious individual. He wanted to be famous. He wanted to carve out his place in history, and he did that. How he did that is particularly interesting. The reality was that he isn't really the father of German armored warfare. He was one of a team of German leaders in the 1920s and 1930s, panzer pioneers. In fact, he was a junior member of that team, and he rode the coattails of other more successful panzer pioneers, and ultimately came to eclipse them in his rise to ascendancy. And he rose to ascendancy by basically treading on anyone who was in his way and stabbing them in the back. But he also, his rise to dominance and leadership, ultimately as Inspector General of German Armored Forces in 1943, really was accomplished by putting the backs out of basically every single military leader that he interacted with. He had a tremendous ego. He was very frank in his assessments, and he really created a great deal of institutional friction, unnecessary institutional friction. So he has some very negative views of much of the rest of the German army, the infantry, the artillery, the cavalry branch, the general staff. And the great irony of the war was that after the 20th July 1944 assassination plot against Hitler, Hitler appointed him as acting chief of the general staff, an institution that he actually had a great deal of ambivalence towards, because his own career in the 1920s was derailed by his sympathy for extreme right-wing German nationalism when he had been a member of the Freikorps and essentially disobeyed orders of the Reichswehr and got himself in a lot of trouble. And he was sent out as punishment. He was sent to the 7th Bavarian Motor Transport Battalion as punishment. And it's there that he would have an opportunity that otherwise he would never have got to work with mechanization, work with developing what would become some of the key ingredients of German Blitzkrieg warfare. And of course, that label Blitzkrieg, of course, never existed. The Germans never had that term. That was a term invented by an American news reporter, and subsequently adopted for propaganda purposes by the Germans.
I always joke with my students, it's like harikiri, right? It's not actually a German. It's not actually a Japanese term.
Right.
It's somebody made up.
Right.
All right, well, we've just run out of time, but we've talked and perhaps maybe probed or questioned some of these interesting myths about World War II. But thank you very much, Russell, for joining us here at ThinkTech.
It's great to be back. Thank you very much.
And we'll be back next week with Global Connections. I'm Patrick Bratton.